Okay, as it is 4 o'clock, I'm going to go ahead and open up this, our first inaugural KPSRL webinar. So welcome all. It's really great to see the turnout already, and we're really encouraged and excited to be able to reaching out to our community in this new way. We are joined today by Jack Farrell of M&E for Peace, who I'll be very excited to introduce in a little bit more depth in a few minutes. But first, I'd like to please introduce myself. My name is Megan Price. I am the head of office at the Knowledge Platform for Security and Rule of Law, which is a community of sorts that is working to share knowledge, ideas, challenges, brainstorms with one another in the security and rule of law community, especially those focusing on improving security and rule of law in fragile and conflict-affected settings. So that is myself. I'd also like to take the opportunity to briefly introduce my colleague Melissa, who is working to help us today also with the Q&A, and she is our communications and logistics colleague. So Melissa, if you just want to say hi.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us today.
Great, thanks. So first of all, I just want to give you a quick overview of the goal that we have for this series of webinars. Basically, we at the Knowledge Platform are looking to reestablish the environment of trust and learning in this new way, in this new environment online. And most importantly, we really want to make sure that we are maintaining our engagement with our community and encouraging you as our community to continue to put forward your insights, your skills, your ideas, and to generally share them for the greater good of the security and rule of law sector. And also to help signal to us what needs to be on the agenda. So with that, I'd really like to encourage you, if you have any ideas of webinars that you would like to see or perhaps yourself host, please feel free to get in touch with us. This is a space that we like to create for you, our community. So there'll be a couple different ways in which you can do that, maybe most easily by answering the post-event survey that you'll be receiving at the end of this webinar. Secondly, and very importantly, I'd like to note to everyone that the session is being recorded. That is in order to allow us to be able to share it more broadly, archive it, and put it out on our website and on YouTube so that others may benefit, even if they are not currently at this moment available to join. With that said, this means that those who speak and have their questions perhaps put forward out loud, your name and your voice will be captured in that recording. So if you'd like to consider that as an important feature of how you want to engage in this session, please know that if you speak your question aloud, your name and your voice will be recorded. But that shouldn't inhibit you from being able to participate in the Q&A. So we have two options at the end of the webinar that Jack will present to ask a question. One is to raise your hand. To do that, you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen the option to raise your hand. That will signal to Melissa that you have a question that you would like to voice out loud, and she will call on people whose hands are raised in turn. If you would prefer to remain anonymous, or if you prefer simply not to speak a question aloud, you can also submit your question via the Q&A box. You'll find that also on the bottom of your screen. Melissa will also be monitoring the submissions of questions there, and she will read from those questions. So if you type it into the Q&A box, she may choose your question to address to Jack. Okay, so I hope that that's all the logistics. Now that I've gotten that out of the way, I really want to take a bit of time to introduce our inaugural webinar speaker, Mr. Jack Farrell. Many of you already know Jack. He's something of a celebrity in our field. For those of you who do not, please let me take this opportunity to encourage you to look into the work of Jack and his team at M&E for Peace. That's Design, Monitoring, and Evaluation for Peace. This is an organization or a platform that I think is kind of a kindred spirit of the KPSRL, in that we are both focused on the value of creating a community around sharing knowledge, sharing resources. On the M&E for Peace website, you will find a virtual treasure trove of resource materials, webinar series that will help with program design, monitoring, and evaluation relevant to peace building, to humanitarian actors, to development actors. So I really do encourage you to go check it out, subscribe, use their resources, and also upload your own if you find them relevant and worth sharing. One of the most popular resources on that website is the Thursday Talk series. This is a webinar series that Jack hosts each week. And again, you can find a rich archive of webinars that focus on various solutions and innovations around measuring peace, and specifically all of its many intangible offshoots. It's an incredibly challenging field that we work in, so it's great that M&E for Peace is there to help build collaboration. It's a fantastic resource. Jack has been a good friend of the platform for as long as I can remember, and has been making great strides in building the M&E for Peace platform over the past few years. So what better person than him to look to, as we here at the KPSRL are looking to help reinvent our community a little bit and transition into an online event. And as I referenced before, we want to make sure that our community feels able and encouraged to animate this space that we provide. So we want you to help set the agenda. We want you to share your ideas, continue sharing your knowledge. So we're confident that Jack is going to be able to share with you today some skills and perhaps some inspiration for putting together and presenting your own webinar. And we would hope that the KPSRL might provide you a space to share that. With that, I hope that's a sufficient introduction. With that, I'm now going to give the floor over to Jack, and we can begin the session.
Megan, I am going to get you to, or ask you to introduce me to every webinar or presentation that I give in the future, because that was absolutely fantastic. And a big thank you to Megan, to Melissa, and the team at the Knowledge Platform for inviting me to be here today on the first webinar. I'm feeling a bit nervous, and I'm really excited to chat with you all, share some insights that I have from hosting webinars, but also to learn from your experience in online facilitation and in facilitating sort of difficult dialogue online. I'm going to stop my video as we move through the presentation so I can click through it properly. But yeah, so here we are, webinars. Who would have thought webinars would be part of our lives? I know I'm not the only one who thought that webinars died in the mid-2000s. And I always assumed that they were a low technology, kind of antiquated form of learning that was confined to the college classroom. And then I joined the peace building field. And that happened about 5 years ago. And I quickly realized that webinars are a key part of our dissemination strategy of increasing the utilization of key resources and tools, of socializing key learning, and developing a shared sense of learning and community. Now, webinars can act as an equalizer. They allow us to share tools and information with those who need it most, while also providing a platform for us to showcase both local voices and the amazing work being done by local practitioners. So, as a bit of background to my experience, as Megan said, I currently lead the M&E for Peace project at Search for Common Ground. And Megan probably gave a better introduction than I ever could, but M&E for Peace is a global learning platform for the peace building, development, and humanitarian fields. And as Megan noted, one of the things we've become known for over the past few years are our Thursday Talk webinars. These Thursday Talk webinars highlight best practices and innovations in our field. They're 45 minutes long, 15 to 20 minutes of presentation followed by moderated discussion. We started those webinars back in 2014 with around 10 live attendees, and we're now averaging over 100 live participants on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. I've hosted 100 of these webinars, as well as a number of different webinar series for specific audiences, donors, and regions, including a number of different What Works series in different conflict-affected contexts. So what I've learned about hosting webinars comes from firsthand experience of both success and failure, and following of a clear following of Samuel Beckett's try again, fail better. And with failures that range from technology failing, Wi-Fi crashing, microphones not working, to some bad jokes that I've made online. But I use all of these failures to learn more about my approach, to learn more about online facilitation, and develop my skills as we move forward. So a bit of background about how I'm going to structure today's webinar is that I am going to break this down into 3 core pieces. 1, how do you plan your webinars? 2, things to consider during your webinars. And 3, things to consider after your webinars, and then we can break it into a discussion. My goal is really to provide you with practical advice and information that you will be able to directly apply to your own work, I'm going to try to keep this as simple as possible. Nothing I am telling you today is groundbreaking, but I hope that you're going to be able to take it and apply it to your work. So let's get started with today's session. So you decided you want to host a webinar. You had dreams of maybe hosting a podcast or a radio talk show, and you ended up with a webinar. So you aimed for the stars and you landed on the moon, I guess. So what are some things that you should consider when you're thinking about hosting a webinar? Now, the first questions I would ask yourself is, why do you want to host a webinar? What is the purpose of gathering people online? What are you trying to achieve through an online session? Do you want people to absorb information? Do you want people to learn more about other people on the line? Do you want to work through a challenge together? A webinar, just for the sake of having one, can be a waste of your time and everyone else's. So understanding why you want to bring people together is a key consideration as you develop your session. Think about what people want from the webinar. Are you trying to create dialogue? Are you trying to promote discussion? Or are you trying to educate people on a topic? Answering these questions will not only help you shape your format, but also help your promotion of the webinar itself. My next question is, who is your audience? If you know who they are, what do you know about them and what do they want to know? Are your webinars going to be open to the public, or are they private to a specific community? Public discussions can allow you to engage the wider community and facilitate a discussion that is informed by many viewpoints and perspectives. Private discussions can add a level of security and allow you to discuss sensitive topics or hold inclusive discussions with certain demographic groups. The webinar and the discussion dynamic is very different in public and private webinars, so make sure you've thought about this. Now on to questions about structure and format of your webinar. One of the most regularly asked questions I get is, how long should your webinar be? Our attention spans staring at a screen are a lot less than when we participate physically. Online sessions should range in time, but I would absolutely limit any online session to a maximum of 2 hours. And I often suggest that webinars last a maximum of 60 minutes. Now, this may require you to divide your content over a number of sessions, but it means that each session will have a clear purpose rather than try to cram too much content into one session or drag one session on and unnecessarily long. Now, how do you identify speakers and topics? This is similar to questions around audiences. There are a plethora of webinars out there. What's going to make yours unique? What void are you trying to fill in the market? Understanding your intended audience's key interests will help you identify topics and speakers for your webinar. I often get asked how we decide on Thursday Talk guests. 90% of the time, it comes down to my level of interest in a topic. Normally, I see an interesting report, an evaluation or a tool, and I think that'll be a pretty good webinar topic. And I reach out to the author. Another thing to remember is that if you're interested in the topic, your sort of level of energy as a moderator will bring a sort of an added excitement to the dialogue and the discussion, and will bring up the engagement of the participants. Another question is, how do you decide on an online platform? Now, this is a very difficult question to answer. There are a bunch of different webinar platforms you can use, and my main advice is to use the one that feels best to you. You want to use a platform that makes both you and the audience feel secure. So think about the one that best does this. Today, we're using Zoom. It's pretty great. Most people know how to use it. And when you're fully aware of how to manage the technology, it's a pretty great platform. On the Thursday Talks, we use GoToWebinar. The reason we use GoToWebinar is both due to institutional sort of structure that we've had in place since 2014, but also we are catering to an audience with low internet bandwidth, and GoToWebinar allows us to share our content with that audience most effectively. And once you've decided on a platform, I think it's really important to provide people with a guide on how to join the session. So we often take our familiarity with technological platforms for granted. Because so many communities were forced into lockdown so abruptly, this is many people's first experiences in engaging in online work or dialogue. So I provide participants with a step-by-step guide on how they can access an online session. And now on to the final things to consider as you plan your webinar, the preparation. Develop a script and timeline. One of the benefits of speaking online and not in person is that it allows you to follow a script. Script your remarks beforehand and create a timeline and time breakdown for the webinar itself. This will allow you to structure your content and allow you to keep the webinar on track. I often tell people when they're developing their script that it takes time to find your own voice. So play around with your approach until you feel comfortable. Your goal as a moderator or a host is to make the audience and guests feel at ease. So try to do that with your content. I, for example, I'm one of those really corny and awkward people that build in a few jokes into every webinar. And that's my way of breaking the ice and putting people at ease. The unfortunate fact of most webinars is that the audience are muted. So I am just assuming that they're laughing, rolling around on the floor laughing with me as opposed to at me. Another key aspect of webinar preparation is making time for a technical run through. If you have a guest, this is a great opportunity for you to connect ahead of time to test the quality of their microphone, the quality of your microphone, and make sure they're comfortable accessing the platform and that they have an idea of the breakdown for time as well as the format of the webinar itself. Now, my next point is on sharing an agenda or overview of the session with the participants. You should let people know what's planned and set reasonable expectations. You must recognize that some people might be unfamiliar or insecure about meeting people online. So a way of sort of mitigating this is sharing an agenda with them in advance. Don't be overambitious in assuming that people will have read documents or watched videos ahead of time. So be cautious about being overambitious in what you can achieve through your 1 hour webinar session. And then finally, consider other logistical challenges. Use these challenges to decide whether or not you need support. Just as with in-person facilitation, having co-facilitators can be very helpful, as with Megan and Melissa today. This has several advantages. It can be more interesting for participants to hear more than one voice or facilitator. You can have someone engaged in the chat while another person focuses on the presentation. You can have someone live tweet the discussion. You can also have other team members listen in, capture notes, and check on the engagement. So now that you've planned your webinar, the next thing is to host your discussion. And as you can see, you're now live in 3, 2, 1, breathe. It's really important at the start of every webinar to start slowly. Take your time at the beginning to ensure that people know how to join, and show patience as a facilitator to coach people as they become familiar with the platform. Ease your way into the session. In some of the private webinars I host, I normally welcome people and tell them we'll be waiting a few more minutes to allow people to join and access the discussion. You can set the tone for your webinar from your very first remarks. Good webinars are like a good story. They start and they finish strongly. Your opening remarks matter as they will indicate to the audience the type of webinar or discussion they're in for. You can make it lighthearted or make it formal. This comes down to your personal style and the type of discussion you want to host. My third piece of advice here, speak slowly and clearly. And I recognize that I probably haven't done this at times today already. Yes, you may have the most expensive and fanciest microphone on the market, but this doesn't guarantee that people will understand you. Whether you like it or not, to someone listening, you have an accent, and some people may struggle to understand you, especially non-native speakers. So again, take your time and speak slowly. On to the presentation and the discussion portion. Regarding presentations, I would advise taking a balanced approach. If your primary goal for the webinar is an online training to teach people something, then a presentation is going to dominate the time. If this is the case, consider breaking the presentation into segments, allow for discussion breaks to keep people engaged. If your webinar is to showcase or discuss a certain topic, like today, then I would limit presentations to 50% or less of the time allotted to make room for discussion. Be realistic. It is unrealistic to expect a discussion to start on its own. By that, I mean you can't expect to introduce the topic and hope for the audience to carry it forward. Discussion is often the most fruitful part of these webinars. I know I'm really excited for today's discussion. And discussion provides opportunities for collective learning, and it also enhances the feeling that these discussions are owned by the community and not just by the host. As with any discussion, people can be a bit cold at the beginning and will be hesitant to just ask a question. So I would advise giving the audience content to engage with before giving them an opportunity to ask a question. This could be a presentation or some pre-scripted questions to get the discussion started. Now, keeping people engaged online is a challenge. And if you're worried about keeping people engaged, you can be sure that if there are no opportunities for engagement and the cameras are off, people are likely to be distracted and feel disengaged. One of the perks that I found using the GoToWebinar platform is that you can tell who is listening. You can tell who has their speaker off, who is watching the presentation. And at the end of the webinar, attendees get an attentiveness rating. Now, that is great for finding out which of your colleagues is actually paying attention to your presentation. Outside of a dedicated discussion section, you can use live feedback mechanisms which will help you read the room. These include online polls and surveys to make sure that your session is actively engaging all participants. Many online platforms, such as GoToWebinar and Zoom, have built-in polling and survey capacity. But you can also try external platforms, such as Poll Everywhere. And what about awkward silences? I hate to say it, but awkward silences are inevitable. This is either going to happen due to technological challenges, or it might just be a slow discussion. Not every webinar will be perfect. And you have to recognize that an awkward silence is not a reflection of your skills as a host or a moderator or the standard of the presentation being given. With awkward silences, I would consider scripting some questions in advance and keeping them in your back pocket just in case. Try to identify hooks in a discussion to spin off new avenues for discussion. A very simple one, ask the guest to elaborate a little more on something that they may have explained quickly. And then finally, as with any discussion, particularly in the peace building, development, and humanitarian fields, it is very important to be deliberate about inclusion. Just as you would with in-person facilitation, recognize that there are real and perceived barriers to participation. Many of these barriers will be invisible to you as the online facilitator, and it may take you quite a bit of time to learn to read these cues in online behavior that reflect those barriers. In order to promote participation, give participants options to contribute their comments. So for example, today, participants are able to ask questions in two ways. They can type their question, or they can voice it to the entire group. The other thing I'd be really careful about any discussion portion is, be cautious about allowing people to unmute their microphone on their own, but be careful about over-policing. Given sort of certain security concerns of online platforms, I often try to sort of make sure that the audience are muted and that they have opportunities to raise their hand, and we can sort of organize the discussion in a structured way. There have been a number of development organizations and peace building organizations that have suffered from online discussions being hacked by nefarious actors. So just be aware that that is a potential concern. And as I said with the beginning, one of the most important things about any webinar is finishing strongly. Just as with in-person facilitation, the end is vital. It's what participants will remember the most, and it'll probably influence whether or not they show up to the next webinar. Give people time to acknowledge some of the things that have been said, to agree, to disagree, or add any final remarks. If you find that the discussion is waning and you are a few minutes short of the time you thought it would take today, consider ending the discussion early. You are the moderator, and there are a few things that are worse than a discussion that is dragged on to meet a time limit. So you've hosted a webinar. Congratulations, you survived. You've taken your first step on your way to webinar stardom. Next thing you know, you're probably going to be hosting the daily podcast from the New York Times or commentating on a live sporting event. The world really is your oyster. But how do you know if it went well? So what worked and what didn't? Feedback is key. As with in-person training and facilitation, you want to learn and improve with every opportunity. Send participants a quick poll to follow up and get their feedback. Consider calling a handful of the participants online and asking them what they liked and where they think that they can improve on for next time. Offer people the chance to speak about anything at all regarding the online experience, not just the substance of the discussion or the presentation, So this includes the quality of the microphones, the webinar platform, the time breakdown. Be open to everything and use this feedback to tailor your approach in future sessions. This feedback process never really ends. You should continue this process until you have a format that is specifically tailored to your audience. It is worth noting that many webinar platforms have built-in post-webinar communications, which will allow you to survey people readily and find out what's working and what's not. And depending on the goal of your session, identify next steps and opportunities for continued engagement. Follow up with the participants to provide them with a brief summary of the session, identify clear next steps, and develop a framework for the future engagement of participants. If you're hosting a one-off session, follow up with a thank you note to participants to demonstrate your appreciation for their participation. Now, I know I jumped through a lot of content there, but I really hope to get across how sort of practical these webinars can be, to share some practical advice and information with you all. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them or try my best to answer them. And with that, I will hand back the privileges to Megan.
Thank you so much, Jack. That was really thorough, and I really appreciate the way that you broke it down into kind of the component parts. That always makes what sometimes can feel like an insurmountable, overbearing, large challenge much more manageable, much more digestible, and really, really helpful. So I greatly appreciate it. I know that I was furiously taking notes throughout, so I might have a few questions myself, but I first am going to let our community signal their questions. So there are two ways to go about this. On the bottom of your screen, you have the ability to raise your hand. When you raise your hand, Melissa will be able to see that you've raised your hand, and she will know that you have a question that you would like to address to Jack directly. When she invites you, you may unmute your microphone and then speak your question out loud, and Jack will be able to hear you and respond. It's a much more almost in-person experience. Wouldn't that all be nice? However, if you prefer to simply type your question and have that kind of offered up into the group, feel free. That's also a perfectly legitimate and useful way to share your question. Melissa will also be keeping an eye on the Q&A box. So also at the bottom of your screen, you should have the opportunity to open the Q&A box and submit a question in that way. So those are your two options for being able to offer up a question for the conversation. And I would also, before I turn it over to Melissa, I just also wanted to jump on the opportunity that Jack provided. We are going to be asking you for your feedback on this session. That's just a best practice that we've always tried to follow with the Knowledge platform. So you will be receiving a simple survey. It should take you no more than 3 minutes to give us some feedback on how we're doing, how this went, what you think could be improved. There'll also be some free space for you to put forward whatever comments you might have. There will also be an opportunity in that survey, if you have an idea of content that you would like to see on this platform, an interesting idea, discussion that you would like to lead or at least put forward into our awareness, you can also do it via the survey. Or you can simply write us at any of our emails. They're all posted on our website. We are a very welcoming group. So please don't feel any hesitation to reach out to us in whatever form you feel most comfortable. With that, I would like to go ahead and turn it over to Melissa, who will be moderating the Q&A portion of this session. So as Jack referred to, the Q&A discussion is kind of where we get into even more of the nitty-gritty. It's great to hear from our community about what you feel is useful and interesting, what you want to dig into more. So I think that this can be as equally an informative part of the session as Jack's incredibly informative presentation. So with that, Melissa, I hand over to you. If you have any questions that you've either received in the chat or would like to use to kick off the discussion.
Okay, thanks so much for the introduction, Megan, and thanks a lot for the presentation, Jack. I was also furiously taking notes and remembered to live tweet after your reminder. So we already have one question Just to our participants, I am not going to say your name. If you've typed your question, I'm just going to assume that that meant you wanted to remain anonymous. So if you'd like to introduce yourself and you'd like to share your voice with all of us, please raise your hand. If you want to remain anonymous, please type. So we have one question already. Do you have any advice on do's and don'ts of breakout groups as part of the webinar?
This is a really, really great question. I think when it comes to breakout groups, I tend to only use them in groups that are smaller than 30 people. The reason being is that any more than that, and they get a bit unwieldy. So there's certain webinar platforms that will allow you to break people into groups readily, such as Zoom. And it works really well because as a facilitator, I'm able to drop in, monitor the conversation, and actually bring people back and sort of keep it in a structured way. Zoom is one of the only platforms that allows this. If you're working on Google Hangouts, for example, most people are more familiar with Google, I would consider pre-assigning groups. So ahead of your webinar, ahead of your discussion, send participants an email saying you are a part of group 1, group 2, group 3, group 4, assign them, create a Google Hangout link for them to participate, and give them sort of an element of structure to this. One of the challenges in using breakout groups in platforms that may not allow you to do it readily is that if people go off on their own discussion, they might not come back. So just be aware of that. But I think my main idea around breakout groups is just plan ahead, prepare the groups beforehand, and that will allow you to structure their engagement.
Great, thank you. The next question sort of echoed the first one, and I think you already answered it, but the person wanted to thank you a lot, Jack, and said that your webinar is very useful and that they often have to organize webinars that take a working group format, asking what digital platforms would you recommend for that? So it sounds like Jack just answered that with Zoom and Google Hangouts. Do you have any additional ones that you'd like to add to that, Jack?
Yeah, there's so many great online platforms that I've been testing them a lot recently. At Search for Common Ground, while I lead the DME for Peace project, I've been doing a lot of our work on digital adaptation of peacebuilding programs. So I've tried a number of different sort of online forums, and a couple that stand out are obviously Zoom, GoToWebinar, Google Hangouts is sort of improving all the time. They've added recording features. You can integrate features such as Google Jamboard, which allows for greater collaboration and sort of innovation and sort of replaces the sticky note process. And then another one that I've recommended to our teams is Jitsi. And Jitsi is an end-to-end encrypted platform that has really high quality audio and really high quality video. And it's free to use as well. So it's secure and it's something I've been pushing to other teams. But yeah, those are, if you're looking at working groups and trying to pre-assign and you want to add structure as well as bring people back when they're needed and worried about people dropping off, I would strongly consider using Zoom, and I would strongly consider using the full version of Zoom and not the free version, given that there are certain security concerns over using the free version.
All right, so we have one more from our participant who apologizes for not using audio because they have a noisy child in the background. And they were wondering about webinar promotion and if there's any best practice or ideas on how to secure a good number of participants.
This is a great question. And this comes down to, this is something that I think is an issue for the NGO sort of peace building, development, humanitarian field, is that we don't do communication strategy well at all. And part of it comes down to the fact that we often feel like we don't want to spam people. We don't want to sort of be aggressive with our message. We want to be constructive, but sometimes that doesn't work. So a bit of background about myself is I used to work in political campaign strategy and in US political campaigns, which may sound weird as you're probably working out that I'm Irish. But email marketing is the most effective way to reach people. People may register through social media, through LinkedIn and Twitter, But really where you're going to get most of your registrants is from email. Another piece of nugget of advice I give our teams all the time is that, in your emails, be edgy with your subject lines, be provocative, and then have a clear call to action in the first 100 words of the email. So on DME for Peace, every single email you get is probably coming from a different sender and a different sender's name, and every single subject line is there to try and trick the person into opening their email. The reason we do this is because the NGO and nonprofit average for email open rates is about 16%. And 16% of your audience is not that many people. So you want to increase as many eyes on your content as possible. So yeah, just edgy subject lines. I'd be regular in my communication. People, again, particularly in NGOs, are hesitant to send more than one email a week or 1 to 2 emails a week. But for our Thursday talks, a good example is we'll send an initial announcement on a Friday morning. We'll send a second follow-up on Tuesday morning. And then right before the webinar itself, there will be a third follow-up. And this is going to our entire audience. We change the sender name, we change the subject line, and we're constantly just trying to make sure that we're getting fresh eyes on the clear call to action, which is click here to register now. So I would say email is the best thing to go about, best thing to promote it on, and also look for opportunities for cross-promotion. Many of you on the call today, if you're interested in learning and evaluation, may be a part of the learning listservs, such as Pelican and Eval Talk and Eval MENA and the African Evaluation Association. And those are great channels to cross-promote, depending on the topics you're talking about. So there are many opportunities out there to identify communications channels that you can jump on and piggyback on to promote engagement. And normally then for any kind of webinar, you're really looking at 40 to 50% attendance rate of the registrations you get. So if you're aiming for 100 people to attend, you're going to need well over 200 people registering. And it's just a good metric to keep in mind.
Thanks, Jack. So we have a question now that asks, what about the presentation, the type of presentation that you are using right now? I suppose you're not just using another PowerPoint for attention purposes?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. So I would say that one of my big weaknesses as a former communications person is creating engaging PowerPoints. I started playing with platforms that are not, traditional. So many of you will have used Prezi before. It has some pros and cons, but it has some really engaging templates, and some of the flow of the content works really well. So for this webinar, I thought I would try Prezi. I gave a presentation 2 weeks ago on a similar topic. I used Canva to develop an online PowerPoint, and it was free to use. All of these platforms are free for the most part. So yeah, that's it's something about just attention and flow. If you're a skilled PowerPoint user, PowerPoint is a perfectly great tool. It's just that I know that for someone like me, I like to build off other people's templates, and some of the creative templates that you have in Canva and in Prezi are just a little bit more engaging, a little bit more exciting.
This person wants to ask you if you could give 1 or 2 tangible examples for common problems that you tend to run into during the planning and execution of the webinar.
Wi-Fi is the number one. My audience tends to be 45% of participants are coming from the global south. So internet bandwidth is an issue. One of the goals of our platform is to try to amplify local voices, to provide sort of a platform for their work. And oftentimes when we do have participants coming from countries that may not have great internet penetration, the quality of their connection isn't good enough to either share audio, to share a PowerPoint. So Wi-Fi is something we regularly have to deal with. One of my ways of mitigating this, though, is being explicit with the audience from the get-go that we are going to encounter technical difficulties. I think people appreciate the barriers that you're going to have in a technologically facilitated discussion. So being clear about that from the beginning is key. The other one is, I've also had Wi-Fi examples, Wi-Fi issues as well. When I was based in Washington, DC for 6 years, and you'd be amazed at how bad the Wi-Fi was in downtown DC. Another example is that maybe the discussion's really slow. Sometimes, you know, you just have a presenter or a topic that doesn't work and nobody asks a question. You might have an audience of 150 people and it's just dead silence. So that's a real struggle for as a sort of facilitator, and you're sort of constantly grasping at straws to try and fill the conversation to create some sense of discussion. My advice there is, if you feel a webinar is done, don't leave dead air. Just allow yourself to wrap it up, have the confidence to make that decision and follow it through. Some other examples, people are often most critical about the quality of the audio that they hear. So audio, UPMB is, you know, people are very understanding for videos, people are very understanding if the Wi-Fi drops, but if you've got a bad microphone, people will take you to task on that. So being clear about that and having a good microphone and having high quality audio makes a big difference.
Great, thanks, Jack. So we have a very excited participant who's raising their hand. So I'm excited that we get to hear someone's voice. This is Peter from the Kuno platform. You should be able to speak now, Peter.
Yeah, this is Peter from the Kuno platform. I just unmuted myself, so I think I'm hearable for everybody. I just wanted to experience this because thank you so much for this webinar in the first place. We have been organizing some webinars, and I just wanted to experience this way of getting into the conversation. Is it very difficult for the moderator to give me the floor this way? This was the one question. And the other question is, I see that you disabled the attendee chat. Does it have a reason? Because I can imagine that the attendee chat might be another way of exchanging comments and experiences and thoughts, but it also can get out of control, of course. So is there any reason why you did disable the attendee chat so far? Thank you.
I don't know if you guys want to sort of answer this from your perspective, and then I can offer
Sure.
general thoughts afterwards.
I think that's a great way of moving forward. So yeah, first of all, great to see you, Peter, and well, see you, you know what I mean. Yeah, and these are perfectly primed questions, because actually these are exactly two things that we discussed. So first of all, it was incredibly easy using Zoom to allow you to participate in this way. We simply enable you as an individual to unmute yourself, and then we still retain the opportunity to mute you if we feel that that's necessary, and to lower your hand. So just, not that I'm a spokesperson for Zoom, but just to let you know, that was a fairly easy process. Secondly, yeah, we actually discussed whether or not we should leave the chat box open. We felt that that might overwhelm the different ways of gathering input. So we had kind of people being able to raise their hand, but also use the Q&A box. And we didn't want people to get the Q&A box confused with the chat box. And then poor Melissa having to monitor all three simultaneously. Having moderated quite a number of online discussions in the last couple months, that's always been one of my biggest kind of tricks, I guess, or tips, is to really narrow the sources of information that you need to monitor as a moderator, because it can be very overwhelming sometimes, and it can get very distracting. So those were our choices. They're not to say that they're the best, they're just what we went with in this format. But Jack, if you have any other added comments on that.
Yeah, I think, Peter, I think you made a great point here. If you were having a closed session and this was with a limited audience, I would encourage the use of a discussion. And that closed session just adds an added level of privacy. And like you said, it's another avenue for collaboration, for discussion, for community collective identity development. As today's webinar was being promoted online and was publicly available, when you leave yourself open to these discussions, you can leave yourself open to sort of bad actors and people sort of hijacking conversations and taking control in a way that will ruin the discussion for everyone else. So I think it's one of the most important things as an online facilitator and as a moderator of a platform like this is you want to make sure that you create a safe space for everyone taking part. And just by disabling the comments on a public webinar, that's just another way and another sort of level of security that you're adding.
All right, we don't have any current open questions, nor do I see any hands raised. Now's an opportunity to raise that hand or type a question if you have any.
Actually, Melissa, I might have myself a question if I may, and maybe give other people an opportunity to think about what they might want to ask as well. This is actually reflecting a little bit of the environment, or let's say maybe the community that we work with. Jack, you have this similarly with your peace building and kind of development and humanitarian aid community. And then we work specifically with security and rule of law actors. And I'm wondering if there are ways in which your presentation style maybe fits to that community, either in terms of the way in which you take extra precautions with the security around your webinars, whether or not it's all the more important to create trusted groups, or whether, you know, navigating what are sometimes quite difficult and politically contentious conversations, if a webinar is the right format, or you've been able to find a way to make the webinar the right format. This is something that's been on my mind a lot lately as we've moved from in-person discussions where that atmosphere is relatively easy to create in person with a small group of people. How do you create that online is a big question that I've had on my mind.
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, Megan. I think that hearing me speak today will, if anybody's ever joined a Thursday Talk webinar, will realize that I'm probably speaking in a very different way compared to how I speak on Thursday Talks. And that's because, you know, I've developed a voice that is specific to that community. And I host a number of other webinars, a number of other very sensitive and sort of politically sensitive as well as conflict sensitive discussions. Those I've had to develop my own voice that meets the specific needs of that community and hits the right tone. So being very careful, being cautious, and just, you know, a little less understanding. You know, I'm not going to make a joke in a webinar where we're discussing sort of abuses of conflict sensitivity or sort of mass atrocities, where I don't think it's fitting. So yeah, I think it's really challenging. I think one of the biggest challenges we have with online spaces is just creating a sense of security for people to share their insights, to share their inputs, and feel like they can meaningfully contribute. Just as in physical events, you know, inequalities are often represented in online discussions. So trying to create those spaces is really difficult. There are a good facilitation and strong facilitation will allow you to mitigate some of these. But one of the challenges that you have is, you know, just being able to read the room. And whenever you're presenting a session in person, you're able to tell, you know, what's landing with people, what's not landing with people, whether or not people are shocked or appalled by what you're saying. So I think it's building in feedback mechanisms that are real time, so that allow you to respond within the webinar itself to some of the feedback you're getting. So like I said, like a live poll or you know, an open discussion forum, just to say, does this make sense? Will allow you to get there. And another thing is planning ahead of time. So if you're worried about people feeling isolated during a webinar or people being too worried about connecting, consider pairing someone up with a partner beforehand. Give them someone to sort of be introduced to talk through some of the ideas on the webinar. And that dual accountability adds another level of security. I think it's a challenge that we're all working through at the moment. We work in some really difficult and dynamic contexts. And I think our understanding of this will develop a lot in the coming months. But those are just a couple of ideas that I would use to counter that.
Great, thank you very much. I think we're all in this together a bit in that way. So thanks.
Are there any last questions? We probably have time for one more if anyone has one last question they'd like to field to Jack. Otherwise, thank you all so much for your questions. You certainly answered a lot of things that I was wondering as well. If you didn't have a chance to answer your question or something comes to your mind later, you can also email myself and I can forward that to Jack, or if it's something that we feel that we can answer at the Knowledge Platform, we'd be happy to. But feel free to also reach out after this webinar concludes. But other than that, I'm going to hand this back to Megan and Jack to conclude. Thank you all so much.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. Just a final word from me to watch your inboxes, because we would love to have feedback from you on how you felt this went, how we can improve, and also to have your ideas. Now that you have a few tricks in your back pocket to put together your own webinar, if you have ideas about content that you'd like to share with our community, I really strongly encourage you to share those with us, and we can talk about ways in which we can set the agenda together. So please do answer our survey and get in touch with us with future ideas. And one last note from my side, at least, that we have another webinar coming up next Tuesday, June 2nd. This one will be with our partners at Mercy Corps. They'll be discussing the way in which the COVID-19 pandemic has affected social cohesion in many of their field offices with their programs. This is something I think a lot of us are dealing with. We'll be joined by their primary conflict advisor and one of their field staff organizers to kind of discuss the impact of COVID specifically on social cohesion. So I want to one more time thank you very, very much, Jack, and encourage everyone to go check out DME for Peace for all the resources that they provide. And a huge thanks to you, Jack. And I'm going to turn my video on for this one because we really, we really appreciate you taking the plunge with us. And thank you.
Thank you so much.
Word goes to you.
It's weird to be on the other side and to be the one developing a presentation. Thank you to everybody for joining. One thing I will say is that if you're interested in learning more about online facilitation, like I said, this today was very much specific to developing your own webinar series, thinking about the platform, thinking about during the session and after the session. But if you have questions about online facilitation, facilitating difficult discussions online, next week on DME for Peace, we have Celia and Celia's CEO speaking on how to facilitate online discussions. And she is wonderful and expert and knows far more about this than me. So please, I'd encourage you to join. That'll be a great discussion. And information will be on the DME for Peace website about that.
Awesome.
But it was great. I'm really happy I was able to participate and connect with a new group. And I wish you guys all the best on this sort of webinar adventure.
Great. Thanks again, Jack. And thank you to everyone here. And have a great rest of your week. Thanks, guys.